Okay, so let's just be real for a second. The book of Numbers, it's probably the book you skip, right? It feels like the Bible's biggest speed bump, this huge wall of text that just grinds your reading plan to a halt. But what if I told you that buried in all those lists and laws is one of the most powerful stories about failure, faith, and formation in the entire Bible? I mean, the name alone, Numbers, it just screams boring. You immediately think of, long, dry census details, this travel log of a bunch of people complaining, and a ton of names you can't pronounce. It's where the best intentions to read through the Bible just fizzle out. But that whole perception, it's all based on a huge misunderstanding that actually starts with the title itself. And right here, this is the key that unlocks the whole thing. See, our English title, Numbers, comes from the Greek translation, but the original Hebrew title is Bamidbar, and that one word changes everything. It has nothing to do with numbers. It means in the wilderness. So this isn't a math book. It's the epic story of a journey. And you really have to get this. In the biblical imagination, the wilderness isn't just some timeout corner for misbehaving people. It's the training ground. In fact, the Hebrew word for wilderness, midbar, it comes from the exact same root as the word for speak, which is davar. It is literally the place where God speaks, where he takes a group of escaped slaves and starts forging them into a nation with a real destiny. So once you start seeing the book as this journey in the wilderness, even the parts that seem the most random and boring start to show this incredible, almost shocking, divine order. Okay, so why all the counting? To us, it just looks like boring statistics, right? A simple head count. But what was really going on was the strategic organization of an army. God wasn't just counting people, he was bringing military discipline and order to his people, getting them ready to step into the promise he'd made them. And that sense of order gets even more specific. The book gives these incredibly meticulous, almost tedious instructions for how the 12 tribes of Israel were supposed to set up their camp around the tabernacle, which is where God's presence was. So you've got to ask yourself, why so much detail? Is this really just about ancient camping rules? Or is there something else going on here, something hidden in plain sight? And this is where the hidden genius of this book just blows you away. When you actually map out the camp's formation from a bird's eye view, with the lead tribes on each of the four sides, it forms the unmistakable shape of a massive cross, with God's presence right there in the center. We're talking centuries before Jesus, and the symbol of the cross was already covering God's people in the wilderness. It's incredible. But the book isn't just about these big divine patterns. It's also about some really deep human struggles. This is where we see a people getting forged into something new. And, well, the process is pretty messy. We read about all the complaining the Israelites did, and our first reaction is to judge them. Like, how could they be so stubborn, so ungrateful? But if you look closer, the text is inviting us to be a little more compassionate. I mean, these people were born into centuries of brutal slavery. They're learning how to trust for the very first time. So what sounds like just stubbornness is actually the voice of unprocessed trauma. And this all just comes to a head in the famous story of the 12 spies. They scout out the promised land, and 10 of them come back with this terrifying report, and they summarize it with this absolutely heartbreaking line. That's how they saw themselves, like tiny, insignificant bugs. You see, the giants in the land were never the real problem. The real problem was a crisis of self-image. Their grasshopper identity, an identity that was shaped by slavery and fear, was a much bigger enemy than any giant could ever be. They weren't defeated by the enemy in front of them. They were defeated by how they saw themselves. But in the middle of all this, the book also gives us tools for finding purpose and identity, like the Nazirite vow. Now, we usually think of this as some kind of super spiritual status for people trying to be extra holy. But the word Nazir just means set apart. It was a tool that anyone could use to enter a temporary season of intense, undistracted devotion for a specific mission. It was about focus, not about status. And as we keep moving through this journey, we find that these major events aren't just things that happened. They're powerful symbols, prophetic pictures that are pointing to a much, much bigger reality. Take the famous priestly blessing, "The Lord bless you and keep you." We hear that and we think, oh, what a beautiful prayer. But the original text shows something way more profound is happening. God literally tells the priests, "In this way you shall put my name upon the people." This wasn't just a nice wish, it was a divine declaration. It was God placing his own identity, his own presence, on them like a seal. And the same thing goes for that really weird story about the bronze serpent, remember? The people are dying from snake bites, so God tells Moses to put a bronze snake on a pole, and anyone who looked at it would live. Now, this wasn't magic. It was an act of faith, of trusting in God's very strange, but very specific, way of providing healing. And it was such a powerful symbol that Jesus himself later used it as a metaphor to explain his own crucifixion. So, as we get to the end of the book, the whole tone starts to shift. It pivots away from all the failure and moves toward hope. The focus is now on a new generation, a new inheritance, and a really surprising picture of what God's justice looks like. The whole book is framed by two different censuses. The first one counts the generation that came out of Egypt. That's a generation defined by fear, the one that died in the wilderness. But the second census, decades later, isn't just a repeat, it's a total reset. It's God establishing a new identity and a new structure for the generation that will finally inherit the promise. And tucked away in these final chapters is one of the most remarkable and overlooked stories of justice in the entire Old Testament. It's all about 5 women known as the daughters of Zelophehad. So in this story, these 5 women, who had no brother to receive their family's land inheritance, they boldly go right up to Moses, they argue their case, and then in this just stunning moment, God himself steps in and sides with them against the existing cultural tradition. He establishes a new law to protect the inheritance rights of women. What seems like just a minor legal detail is actually this profound revelation of God's heart for justice and for the vulnerable. So, at the end of the day, the book of Numbers isn't what we thought it was at all. It's not this dry, boring record of a generation that failed. It's the dynamic, messy, and ultimately hopeful story of God's relentless faithfulness in preparing a new generation for their destiny, right in the middle of the wilderness. Which kind of leaves us with one last question to chew on. If a book that we call Numbers can hold this much meaning, what other boring parts of history or scripture, or even our own lives, are just waiting for us to take a second look, hiding a much deeper and more powerful truth right there in plain sight?